this logo, this name. Two things that immediately elicit a powerful response in any metalhead's mind and heart. Sometimes there are bands that come around once in a generation, once in a lifetime, and provide such a level of importance and such a level of impact on a genre and so many musical genres that you will never be able to state it properly or emphasize it correctly enough to pass on to people. And today I'm going to be talking about one of those bands. A while ago on my community tab, I did a post that was asking for you guys to say which band you would like an introduction or a history video of, or just a praise video of, and with over 1,200 votes, thank you so much, Death won the poll by a near landslide. So let's take a dive into the history and the background and some of the reasons why the band Death are one of the most important bands not only to death metal, but to heavy metal as a whole. There are some names in the metal genre that you just hear and you turn around slowly and go, holy shit, I know who you're talking about. And I would say that Chuck Schuldiner is one of those names. He was a vocalist and he was a guitarist. And in 1984 in Florida, he formed the band Death. Death metal in its infancy is always a fun thing to examine because you had so many diverging lanes of bands that were doing a variety of different things and were taking in their influence from a variety of different subgenres and genres. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, you would start to see some of the forefathers of the genres known as death metal and black metal. And all of these bands, what they were accomplishing is they were taking the format of thrash metal and specifically the speed metal that had become popular in the 1970s underground music heavy metal scene and playing it much more extreme, employing a variety of new techniques when it came to how they orchestrated guitar riffs, how they handled percussion, how they handled vocals, and how they handled production, leaving everything sounding so fresh and so new and so exhilarating and setting the framework for what would later become some of the most well-known subgenres in all of heavy metal, pushing the boundaries with every single hellfire thing that they produced and bleeding out innovation through their passion and through their determination to take heavy metal and put it in a lane that it had never been put into prior. In the early 1980s, there were two bands that got credited with creating the style that we now know as death metal. One of those names being Death and the other being Possessed with their record Seven Churches. Now, whether or not you want to argue about whether, Seven Churches or Scream Bloody Gore were the first death metal record, I think that they both have their validity, and I think both were inspired by the thrash metal scene. So I think tit for tat, one is no better than the other because they both left their impact on the genre, and I think arguing which classic amazing record came first just isn't really worth it. Now, if you want to argue about like Venom and Bathory with like black metal, I think that's a lot more of an interesting argument, but we're not here to talk about Venom and Bathory, we're here to talk about Death. Because unknowing to their future, Death would become one of the most important and integral bands when it came to developing a variety of techniques, or at least putting them in the mainstream when it came to the extreme metal veneer. Whether it be a palm-muted technique in playing the guitar, whether it be drum kicks or blast beats being incorporated, a variety of heavy, throaty, shriek-like vocals that were also very grunterial, a lot of production techniques that would later inspire a ton of bands in the 1990s and the 2000s, grunterial vocals, shriek-type vocals, and thrash metal influence being pushed to the heaviest degree, not to mention the audible, murky type of bass playing that would become a staple for so many heavy, hard-hitting death metal bands as it would progress throughout its timeline. Death were also part of the emerging Florida death metal scene, which would pretty much write out the blueprint for an entire subgenre of death metal and take the genre to new heights. While a lot of other bands were playing in the more thrash metal-centric veneer, and certainly these early death metal bands from the Florida death metal scene did as well, they were taking a lot more hints from some of the extreme metal bands that were around the contemporary time, such as like Celtic Frost and Venom and Bathory, and doing a lot of techniques that would be a lot heavier and a lot more rich in their texture. Bands that came from this scene include like Morbid Angel, Deicide, Obituary, obviously Death, and even bands like Cannibal Corpse and malevolent creation, moved to Florida to be part of this emerging scene. That was how well respected in the underground it was, and so much of the style of these grittier OSDM bands that are having this resurgence nowadays, and these bands that are sort of bearing the torch and paying homage to the past, pretty much all of the bands that they are copycatting come from the Florida death metal scene. Because while the rest of the states were playing in a lot more of a fast-paced, frantic, shouty, thrash metal riff-led style, these bands were trying to be heavy, gritty, down-tempo, low, palm-muted, and just ferocious, and were pushing the extremity to a level of intensity that you were not hearing in the contemporary scene. The Florida death metal scene were just diverging from this entire concept and taking a level of sonic complexity that would influence not only death metal bands in the future, but would also be major influences to the technical death metal and the melodic death metal scene. Now, before we get into the discography and some more about the impact of death specifically, one thing to take note of is that Death had a very tumultuous time keeping a solid lineup. And if it wasn't for the motivation of Chuck to continue this band and push it into new directions, Death definitely could have just fell apart and died before they even got a chance to make some of their most groundbreaking and genre-defining records. One thing that is also to be noted about Death is throughout their discography, they saw a very stark difference in how they wrote their material, how they produced their material, and they also kind of switched genres numerous times. They were always staying in the confinements of death metal, but they were definitely not staying in the confinements of how you wrote death metal. They were always innovating and changing up their style. And a lot of people chalk this up to just being, innovation and being experimentation, when that's not actually the case. The reason that Death had so many different styles is because within their lineup, they were pretty much changing their lineups almost every single record. And this includes new drummers, this includes new bassists, this includes new guitarists. And so the tone of their records being given this new breath of fresh air pretty much left every single Death record sounding so astronomically different from the last one, both in production technique, considering that they always like to play around with different producers, but also the musicality, because sonically they were always having this sort of revolving door of different musicians coming from different backgrounds. Members of Sadist, members of Dark Angel, members of Cynic, members of King Diamond, just to name a few, graced this band's presence. And that was one thing that Chuck really enjoyed doing, and that is pulling great musicians from other bands, either that were still in the bands or were out of the bands, and putting them to use in Death's growing sound. And that level of ingenuity and sort of experimentation coming from so many different styles pretty much gave Death the identity that it had. And that is the reason why Death is known for having such an experimental and innovative style for so many genres, because you had influence coming from thrash metal, from progressive metal, from death metal, and so many different areas of the world that were pretty much coming together to add to this abomination that Death had become. Whereas other death metal bands at the time were pretty much getting used to playing with the chemistry of the exact lineup that they have, and obviously a lot of bands do have lineup changes, Death were constantly having to refine that chemistry. And there's something to be said about the exhilarating nature of a band playing together for the first time and writing these firework records for the first time and proving themselves as a band, because it was like they were having to rewrite the template every single time for what they were wanting to produce. Just quickly, I will run over some of their discography and what it really posed for the genre as well as the progression. So obviously in 1987 you had Scream Bloody Gore. This was a quick record, and it set the groundwork for what death metal was going to be in the future, similar to what Seven Churches from Possessed did. The riffs were very thrash metal inspired, throttling, pummeling, and it had that old school heavy metal and speed metal production technique. But the things that set it apart was Chuck's ferocious lead vocals that just consumed and ate the mix, and a level of extremity that you were not really hearing in the contemporary scene at the time. The spit and blood of the youthful exuberance they exhibited was pretty much not something that Death was going to hold on to for their entire discography, and it's similar to how like Kill 'Em All from Metallica has a certain level of almost immaturity to it that makes it so amazing. It's a record I own on personal copy, and I think it's a record that deserves to be as well respected as it is. But let's talk about the year 1988 when they released their follow-up record, Leprosy. This record had Scott Burns helping with the production, who would be known for producing a variety of records from a variety of great extreme metal bands like Assuck, Cynic, Deicide, Cancer. There were quite a few of them. And if Scream Bloody Gore was a very thrash metal inspired death metal record, Leprosy took that thrash metal and pushed it to new limits of intensity with the gunshot percussion and the brutality of the vocals. It was insane to hear a band in 1988 already becoming so incredibly heavy on their second studio-length record. But it wasn't until Death's 1990 run that they pushed death metal to its limits even more and really inspired technical death metal and melodic death metal that we are still seeing the influence of so many years later. With 1990, we had Spiritual Healing. And this record was when technical death metal and melodic death metal began to bleed into Death's style. But around this time, those genres were so much in their infancy that Death were not necessarily playing by anyone else's handbook, and were pretty much just writing death metal in a multi-dimensioned way that we were not hearing at the time. And even the bands that were playing around with this and experimenting with this style in the early 1990s, even predating some of like the amazing melodic death metal bands coming out of like Sweden and Norway and just overall the Scandinavian area, especially the technical death metal that would dominate the United States in the 2000s and 2010s, it was amazing to see how death metal was being pushed out of its comfort zone, but not because of the influence of anything, but just because they were enamored with adding more depth and harmonious natures and melodicism into their complexity to write songs that not only functioned as heavy, throttling, groovy death metal songs, but also pushed the genre to new limits by incorporating these new influences. And James Murphy's guitar playing, being pretty much just fascinated with technicality and complexity, would set the tone for what Death was going to impose in the future in their 1990s run, which produced some of the best records that death metal has ever seen. Paul Masvidal and Sean Reinert, which, rest in peace, two members of Cynic that were included on their 1991 record, Human, which continued to push them forward into their technical range, because the musical complexity was showcasing itself even further. And I would say this record is a lot less melodic and a lot more progressive and technical. Not only were they being a technical death metal band, but you could argue that they were a progressive metal band just as much as a death metal band at this point. Don't get me wrong, the heaviness was still there, but to this day, Death is very much unrivaled in just the intensity but the complexity of their riff work, because they weren't just playing at 1,000 BPM and calling it a day. These structures were twisting. They were like labyrinths. There was so much texture and so much depth to everything, holding a very large emphasis and a very high standard on compositions that would not stay in one place for long, progressively and densely packing in every single song with so many twists and turns that you could never understand where they are going to next. And not only did they have this creative and intelligent riff writing, but also the grooviness and the heaviness of signature Death, and it really was a beautiful thing to see around this time. And now we get into the three technical death metal opuses: Individual Thought Patterns, Symbolic, and The Sound of Perseverance. Respectively, these were released in 1993, 1995, and 1998, and they nailed home the technical death metal style of Death. And The Sound of Perseverance, call me fucking basic, but that will always be my favorite Death record. It is the one that I heard first, which is funny because Scream Bloody Gore is my second favorite, even though it's like diametrically opposed, but I'm not here to talk about my personal taste. Another thing I want to point out about these three records is this is where Death's bass work just took a new level of amazing grittiness. Death had always had pretty damn good bass work, but it's on these records that the bass didn't just feel like an accompaniment to the guitar or just a second guitar. I was sitting in these mixes in this remarkably grim way and vile way that just added so much more hellishness to these mixes, especially in these moments of silence, even if they are few and far between. These three records set a sheer precedent for technical death metal and progressive metal that would make Death become not only well regarded as a death metal band, but as a death metal band that always pushed the genre to new heights. Now we get to a bit of a grim part of this story. I don't know if you guys thought that I was going to talk about this, but I feel like I genuinely have to. And that is the tragic end of Chuck Schuldiner. So in 1999, he got a diagnosis for brain cancer. And he continued to work on a variety of musical projects during this time, but he was withering very fast because he had a very bad form of brain cancer. And he was unable to afford surgery at the time. So there was literally a show that was put together where bands were auctioning off items and doing a complete benefit show to try their best to save Chuck Schuldiner's life and to get him these surgeries. Because unfortunately this was around a time where insurance was fucky and he was just not able to get compensated. And despite death being death, the treatment that he needed, he just was unable to afford. And so you saw dozens of big name bands and big name people coming out to do press releases, to do like benefit shows, to auction off items of their own material, to try to raise money, non-profit, to go straight to Chuck to help both him and his family. Featuring everyone from Kid Rock to the Red Hot Chili Peppers to Korn. And one thing when I was researching this that made me smile is at the age of 15, Matt Heafy, the lead vocalist of Trivium's band at the time, played a benefit show to try to raise money for him as well. Unfortunately, it progressed, and as of 2001, he died, and the brain cancer won. But Chuck never stopped making material. Chuck never stopped fighting. He was still producing music, he was still doing lead vocals, he was still doing features, and brain cancer did not win against Chuck. Chuck just said, fuck you, I'm going out on my own terms. He didn't go down without a fight, and he never stopped working to make the musical landscape a more beautiful and a more textured place. And in his absence, Death just could not continue, considering that he had been the only consistent member of Death, and he had been the one to keep it going. And because he had been the sole provider, pretty much, and the imprint of Death, and just, you know those clay things where you have to stamp your hand in, Chuck's was massive on Death. And after this, after The Sound of Perseverance, that was their last record, and Death would never release another studio-length album and would never try to replace Chuck. I have no doubt that Chuck would have continued to create material with Death going forward. I know that he was focused on other projects as well, but the fact that brain cancer denied us of ever hearing anything from Death again is just heartbreaking and tragic, to say the least. But through 7 incredible studio-length albums and a tumultuous lineup and an incredibly intriguing story, Death left an imprint on death metal that I would argue no other band did. Because you can look at bands like Cannibal Corpse inspiring the cookie-cutter death metal people, or you can say that Morbid Angel's record Altars of Madness like inspired so many bands, or you can look at a band like Cynic and say that they were massive for technical death metal, or you can look at a band like Devourment and say that they were huge for brutal death metal and slam metal, or you can look at Possessed and say that they predated Death. Regardless of what you say, when it comes to a certain logo and a certain frontman and a style that would influence not only death metal and technical and melodic death metal bands, but the heavy metal landscape as a whole, there will never be another name that is as revolutionary and massive and well-respected, rightfully so, as fucking Death. Rest in power to Chuck. I hope that wherever you are, you're drinking some beers and kicking back and relaxing the fruit of your labors, brother, because you left behind a fucking legacy and a half. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. What are your opinions of Death as a whole, and what is your favorite record from them? Be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear it. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.